The chief of surgery stood at the foot of my hospital bed, with a folder tucked beneath his arm, looking at me with the kind of careful expression people wear when they already know the answer to a question, but need to hear you say it anyway. "Mr. Walter Dawson," he said quietly, "before we go any further, can you tell me why you transferred ownership of your home, your investment accounts, and your ranch to your son less than 2 hours after waking up from anesthesia?" I stared at him. Not because I didn't understand the question. Because I couldn't remember signing anything, except a clipboard someone kept moving in front of me while the room floated in and out of focus. My mouth felt dry. "I don't think I did." The doctor looked at the woman standing beside him. She wore navy blue scrubs instead of a white coat. Her silver hair was tied back in a loose knot, and there were tiny lines around her eyes that only come from decades of watching people on the worst days of their lives. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked directly at me and asked, "Do you remember asking for your glasses?" I frowned. "Oh, yes." "And do you remember telling your son you couldn't see what he wanted you to sign?" Something stirred inside my memory. Not a complete picture. Just pieces. Bright lights. The taste of plastic from an oxygen tube. My own voice saying, "I can't read that." Then another voice. "It's just insurance paperwork, Dad. They won't discharge you without it." The nurse nodded slowly, almost to herself. I thought so. The room became very quiet. Because this story doesn't start there. Welcome back to Revenge Cold Stories. Before we go any further, drop your first name and the city you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. My name is Walter Dawson. I'm 68 years old. For 43 of those years, I believed that if you worked hard enough, stayed honest, and always showed up for your family, everything else would eventually work itself out. It isn't a philosophy you can teach with speeches. You teach it by example. You leave before sunrise. You miss football games because payroll has to clear. You replace your own truck's transmission in the driveway because paying a mechanic means one less employee gets overtime. That's how I lived. Some people build wealth by chasing opportunities. I built mine by refusing to quit. When I was 24 years old, I borrowed $12,000 against a pickup truck and rented an abandoned machine shop outside Springfield. The roof leaked. The electrical wiring looked like it had survived 3 different decades of shortcuts. The first winter, I kept a propane heater beside the only working lathe because the pipes froze every morning. By the 5th year, Dawson Precision Manufacturing employed 14 people. By year 15, we had 63. When I retired at 66, the company employed 218 workers across 2 facilities and produced custom-machined aerospace components for 6 major contractors. People assume retirement happened because I became wealthy. It didn't. It happened because I was tired. There's a difference. After taxes and the sale of the company, I owned my home outright, had approximately $6.8 million invested across conservative portfolios, and still held the 800-acre ranch where my wife and I had spent every anniversary planting another oak tree. None of it appeared overnight. Every dollar had a memory attached to it. Every acre had sweat buried underneath. But money has a strange way of changing how people remember your life. Especially your own family. My wife Margaret used to understand that. She died 7 years before my surgery. Cancer. 21 months from diagnosis, until the morning I held her hand for the last time. She had this habit of squeezing my fingers twice, whenever she wanted to remind me everything would be okay. Even at the end. Especially at the end. After she passed, the house became impossibly quiet. Not empty. Quiet. There's a difference there too. You can fill an empty room with furniture. You can't fill the silence left by someone who knew exactly how you took your coffee after 41 years. Our son Daniel was 42 when all this happened. People will probably expect me to describe him as greedy. That would make the story simpler. It would also be dishonest. Daniel wasn't born selfish. He was born frightened. As a little boy, he hated disappointing people. If he got a 96 on a spelling test, he'd ask what happened to the other 4 points. If he struck out during Little League, he'd apologize to every teammate individually. He carried failure around like other children carried backpacks. I should have noticed what that kind of pressure becomes when someone grows older. Some children become resilient. Others become desperate to look successful. Daniel chose appearances. Not because he enjoyed lying. Because somewhere along the way, looking successful felt safer than admitting uncertainty. He graduated with a business degree. Started 3 companies. Closed all 3 within 8 years. None of them failed because Daniel lacked intelligence. He actually had remarkable instincts. He failed because he couldn't tolerate slow progress. If something didn't grow immediately, he'd borrow money to make it look like it had. Image first, reality later. That pattern followed him into every part of his life. His wife, Rebecca, was different. She believed stability came from planning every possible outcome. Spreadsheets, 5-year projections, retirement calculators, emergency funds for emergencies that had never happened. She wasn't cold. She simply believed anxiety could be defeated through preparation. The problem with that philosophy is simple. Life refuses to follow spreadsheets. Then there was my granddaughter, Emily. She was 16. Bright, curious. The only member of the family who still wandered into my workshop, just to ask what I was building. She reminded me of Margaret more than anyone else ever had. Not because she looked like her grandmother. Because she listened before speaking. That quality is becoming rare. Daniel often joked that I treated Emily like an apprentice. Maybe I did. She learned how to sharpen chisels before she learned algebra. At 14, she could rebuild a lawnmower carburetor. At 15, she helped me restore a 1968 Ford pickup over 14 weekends. Some people inherit money. She inherited patience. Looking back now, I think patience frightened her father. Because patience exposes shortcuts. The first time I realized Daniel saw me differently happened decades before the hospital. I was 37. He was 11. I'd promised to attend his school's father and son science fair. Instead, one of our machines failed during a Rush Aerospace order, worth nearly $400,000. Missing the deadline would have bankrupted us. So I called, explained, apologized, worked 19 straight hours. When I got home, Daniel was asleep on the couch, wearing the blue ribbon he'd won without me. He never complained. Not once. The next morning he simply said, I knew work was more important. Those 7 words stayed with me longer than any argument could have. Children don't always remember what happened. They remember what they concluded. He concluded that achievement mattered more than presence. I spent the next 25 years trying to prove otherwise. Maybe I succeeded. Maybe I didn't. After Margaret died, Daniel began visiting more often. At first I appreciated it. He mowed the lawns, brought groceries, helped organize tax documents. He insisted I shouldn't climb ladders anymore. Reasonable suggestions. Then came smaller comments. You don't really need all this space anymore. The ranch is a lot for one person. Managing investments gets confusing after retirement. Each sentence sounded practical. None sounded manipulative. Not individually. That's how influence works. Rarely through one dramatic conversation. Usually through hundreds of ordinary ones. Around that same time, I began experiencing abdominal pain. Nothing severe. Just persistent enough that my physician ordered additional imaging. The diagnosis surprised everyone. A section of my colon required surgery. The surgeon assured me the procedure had a 96% success rate with relatively routine recovery. I wasn't frightened of the operation. I'd survived harder things. What worried me was losing independence, even temporarily. Daniel immediately volunteered to handle everything. Hospital paperwork, transportation, insurance calls, medication schedules. "Dad," he said, smiling, "for once let me take care of you." And those words landed exactly where they were supposed to. Every father wants to believe his son has become capable enough to return the care he once received. So I accepted. The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early October. I remember waking before dawn, making coffee even though I wasn't allowed to drink it. Standing on the back porch watching sunlight reach the oak trees Margaret and I had planted over 4 decades. 41 trees. One for every anniversary. I counted them. Not because I forgot the number. Because rituals comfort us when uncertainty arrives. Daniel picked me up at 5:30. He seemed distracted. His phone buzzed constantly. Twice he stepped outside while we waited for preoperative admission. When he returned, he smiled too quickly. "Business never sleeps." I believed him. The operation lasted just over 4 hours. Everything afterward exists inside fragments. Voices, lights, pressure cuffs tightening around my arm. Someone asking me to rate pain from 1 to 10. A nurse adjusting blankets. Another checking monitors. Then, a clipboard. Or maybe several. It's strange what anesthesia does to memory. Large events disappear. Tiny details survive. I remember asking where my glasses were. I remember someone saying they'd been placed inside the bedside drawer. I remember reaching toward it. Then another hand stopping mine. "I've got it, Dad." Only, I never received them. Instead, papers appeared. One after another. A pen pressed into my fingers. My signature becoming slower each time. The letters uneven. Floating. I remember saying, "I can't read this." And someone laughing softly. It's standard hospital stuff. I wanted to argue. But staying awake felt heavier than lifting concrete. Everything drifted. Until one sentence broke through the fog. "If we don't finish now, it'll delay everything." Delay what? I didn't know. I signed anyway. Or thought I did. The memory dissolved again. When I finally became fully alert the following morning, Daniel wasn't there. Rebecca visited briefly. She seemed unusually cheerful. "Everything's going to be so much easier now," she said. I assumed she meant my recovery. I smiled. "I'm looking forward to sleeping in my own bed." She hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second before answering. "Yes, about that, we'll talk once you're stronger." At the time, it barely registered. Pain medication has a way of smoothing rough edges off conversations. 3 days later, I returned home. Only nothing felt quite the same. To be continued. The first thing I noticed wasn't that anything was missing. It was that everything had been rearranged. Not dramatically. Just enough to make the house feel like someone else's memory of my home, instead of mine. The file organizer that had always sat beside the roll-top desk was gone. The leather binder where I kept property tax receipts had been moved to a lower shelf. Margaret's favorite rocking chair had somehow ended up facing the television, instead of the kitchen window, where she'd spent years watching birds gather around the feeder. Small things, harmless things, until enough of them accumulate. Daniel carried my overnight bag inside, while Rebecca followed with 2 grocery sacks full of soup, crackers, and medication organizers. "We cleaned up a little," she said with a bright smile. "You shouldn't have to worry about clutter while you're healing." I thanked her. Because that's what decent people do when someone helps. Even if the help feels strangely unfamiliar. Daniel walked into my office before I had even taken my coat off. "I went ahead and sorted your paperwork." "My paperwork?" Yeah, bills, insurance, banking stuff. He said it casually, almost proudly. I figured you didn't need the stress. For a moment, I stood in the doorway looking at my own desk. The stacks I'd organized by habit for nearly 30 years had disappeared. Everything was inside labeled folders. Neat. Color-coded. Efficient. It should have made me happy. Instead, I felt like a guest. Next time, I said carefully, leave my desk alone. He laughed. You sound exactly like Grandpa. That surprised me. My father had been a difficult man. Hard. Precise. He believed every screwdriver had one proper location, and every conversation had one proper ending. Growing up, I'd promised myself I wouldn't become him. Apparently, age has a way of borrowing traits you once resisted. I'm serious. Daniel held his hands up. Fine, I was just trying to help. There it was again. That sentence. Just trying to help. Over the following week, recovery became my full-time job. Work, rest, medication, short meals, Murray walkings. The surgeon had warned me not to lift anything heavier than 10 pounds for 6 weeks. For someone who had spent 40 years solving problems with his hands, dependence was exhausting. Daniel visited nearly every evening. Sometimes with groceries. Sometimes just to check the thermostat or replace batteries in smoke detectors that didn't need replacing. Each visit included another suggestion. You should think about selling the ranch. You don't need 3 vehicles. What if you moved closer to us? None of the ideas were unreasonable by themselves. What bothered me was how quickly every conversation arrived at the same destination. My life needed simplifying. One afternoon, I decided to balance my checkbook. An old habit. Online banking existed, of course, but I still liked writing numbers on paper. Maybe that's old-fashioned. Maybe it's comforting. I logged into my investment account. The password worked. The balances appeared. Then another screen appeared I'd never seen before. Primary account holder. Walter Dawson. Authorized financial manager. Daniel Dawson. I frowned. That wasn't right. Daniel had power of attorney for medical emergencies. We'd signed those documents years earlier after Margaret became ill. But financial management. I didn't remember authorizing that. I clicked through another page. There it was. Digital copies of recently filed documents. The upload date matched the afternoon of my surgery. I stared at the screen for nearly a minute. Surely there was an explanation. Maybe temporary authorization while I recovered. Maybe paperwork I'd forgotten discussing. I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. Hey, Dad. I was looking at my accounts. Okay. It says you're listed as financial manager. A pause. Barely 2 seconds. Long enough to notice. Though, his voice became lighter. Yeah, that's temporary. Temporary for what? So I can help if bills come in while you're recovering. I've paid my own bills for 43 years. I know. Another pause. It just seemed easier. Easier for who? Silence. Then he chuckled. Dad, you're making a mountain out of paperwork. Maybe I was. Medication still clouded my thoughts. Recovery was slow. My energy disappeared after simple tasks. So I let it go. Or tried to. A few days later, my attorney, Harold Simmons, called. Harold and I had worked together for nearly 20 years. He wasn't a close friend. But after enough estate planning meetings, business sales, and tax discussions, you learn how another person thinks. Walter. Harold. How are you recovering? Getting there. I'm calling because your assistant emailed us several executed documents. My assistant. Daniel. Something tightened inside my chest. What documents? There was a brief rustling of paper. The updated estate package. I didn't update my estate. Another silence. Different from Daniel's. This one sounded confused. Walter. Yes. You personally signed every page. I don't remember meeting with you. You didn't. Then how? I assumed you'd reviewed everything beforehand. I slowly lowered myself into the kitchen chair. What exactly did I sign? Harold stopped answering immediately. Lawyers notice tone. They notice hesitation. They notice the questions clients don't ask. Finally he spoke. I think perhaps we should meet in person. He arrived the next morning carrying a leather briefcase. Instead of sitting across from me at the dining table, he placed the documents side by side. Original estate plan. Updated estate plan. The differences were highlighted. House ownership transferred immediately into a family trust, managed solely by Daniel. The ranch. Transferred. Investment authority. Transferred. Several brokerage accounts. Joint management. Business royalties from a licensing agreement I'd nearly forgotten about. Redirected. I flipped pages slowly. Every signature looked like mine. Because they were mine. Crooked. Uneven. Dragging downhill across the paper. Exactly the way my handwriting looked after surgery. I don't remember this. Harold didn't interrupt. I remember insurance forms. I remember consent forms. I remember discharge papers. But this. I touched the bottom of one page. I would have never signed this without reading every word. I know. His answer came so quickly it startled me. You know. He leaned back. Walter, in 19 years, you've never signed a legal document without correcting punctuation. I laughed once. A short, humorless sound. That was true. I once delayed closing on commercial property because page 12 used the word, approximately, where I believed an exact measurement belonged. Harold remembered. So what happens now? He folded his hands. That depends. On what? Whether you knowingly signed these. I couldn't read. You were under anesthesia. Yes. Medicated. Yes. He nodded slowly. Then we have a serious problem. I looked toward the kitchen window. Margaret had planted hydrangeas beneath it. They were beginning to lose their blossoms. Seasons move forward whether families do or not. I don't want to sue my son. I didn't ask whether you did. No, you asked whether something happened that shouldn't have. He held my gaze. Those are different questions. Over the next week, Harold requested copies of every medical record from the hospital. Medication logs. Recovery notes. Nursing observations. Visitor logs. Everything. The records confirmed what I already suspected. During the first 6 hours after surgery, I'd received enough pain medication to impair judgment. The nurses documented periods of confusion. One note read: patient repeatedly requests eyeglasses before signing documents. Another: patient states he cannot clearly see paperwork. My heart skipped. That mattered. Didn't it? Harold wasn't convinced. It helps. But hospitals process hundreds of signatures every day. We need more. What kind of more? A witness. I almost laughed. Who remembers one patient among hundreds? It had already been nearly 3 months. Even I couldn't remember that afternoon. How could anyone else? Life continued while Harold investigated. Christmas approached. Daniel became strangely attentive again. He insisted on hosting dinner. Rebecca decorated the house more elaborately than usual. Emily asked if we could continue our tradition of building birdhouses after New Year's. For the first time in months, everything almost felt normal. Almost. Until Christmas Eve. Daniel poured coffee after dinner while everyone sat around the fireplace. So, he stirred his cup without looking at me. Have you thought any more about downsizing? Rebecca looked uncomfortable. Emily stared into the fire. I answered honestly. No, it's becoming a lot of responsibility. I've managed it. But for how much longer? The question wasn't cruel. Not on the surface. It sounded practical. Responsible. Concerned. That's what made it hurt. Because hidden underneath was an assumption. That I was already disappearing. That I simply hadn't realized it yet. I'll decide when that time comes. Daniel sighed. You always have to do everything yourself. No, I simply like deciding for myself. He looked away. The conversation ended there. Quietly. No shouting. No slammed doors. Yet somehow the room felt colder afterward. Later that night, Emily found me on the back porch. Snow covered the pasture in soft white lines beneath the moonlight. Grandpa. Yes. Can I ask something? Always. She hesitated. Dad talks about your money a lot. Children tell the truth before they learn the value of editing it. What does he say? Mostly. She searched for the right words. And that he worries you'll give it away. I blinked. Give it away. To charities. Or scholarships. Or anyone except family. I smiled sadly. I've donated money my whole life. I know. She looked embarrassed. I just thought you should know. I rested one hand on the porch railing. When someone talks about inheritance before someone dies. I paused. They stop seeing years. They start seeing calendars. Emily didn't answer. She simply slipped her hand into mine the same way Margaret used to. 2 gentle squeezes. Without realizing it. A week later Harold called again. His voice sounded different. Not excited. Focused. Walter. Yes. I think we found someone. My heart began beating faster. Who? A recovery room nurse. She remembers your surgery. I closed my eyes. After all these months. Someone remembered. And according to Harold, she remembered exactly what happened that afternoon. Harold refused to tell me everything over the phone. Not because he enjoyed suspense. Because after nearly 40 years of practicing law, he'd learned that second-hand memories become weaker every time they're repeated. If she's willing to speak, he said, I'd rather you hear it directly. When? Thursday morning. Here. No. She requested my office. That surprised me. People who know they've done nothing wrong usually don't care where conversations happen. People who work in hospitals understand privacy better than most. I arrived 20 minutes early. Old habit. Harold's receptionist offered coffee. I accepted, then forgot to drink it. Every few minutes I looked toward the hallway, trying to imagine what kind of person remembers one patient after all this time. At exactly 9 o'clock, Harold opened his office door. Walter. Inside sat a woman in navy blue scrubs beneath a grey cardigan. She looked almost exactly the way I remembered from those fragments in my mind. Silver hair. Kind eyes. A small notebook resting on her lap. She stood as I entered. Mr. Dawson. I nodded. Thank you for coming. She smiled politely. I almost didn't. Harold closed the door behind us. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, she took a slow breath. My name is Linda Foster. I've been a recovery room nurse for 32 years. I've cared for thousands of patients. She folded her hands carefully. I don't remember most of them. Then she looked directly at me. But I remembered you. I waited. You kept asking for your glasses. The sentence landed harder than I expected. I remember that. So do I. She leaned forward slightly. You asked 4 different times. Can someone please bring my glasses? I can't read without them. Her voice was calm. Professional. Like someone giving directions instead of reopening months-old memories. I told your son they were in the bedside drawer. I frowned. I never got them. No, you didn't. The room became very still. Linda continued. He opened the drawer. He looked at them. Then he closed it again. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. He said. She glanced briefly at the notebook. Not because she needed to read it. Because she wanted to be precise. Dad, it's only hospital paperwork. My mouth went dry. I remember hearing something like that. She nodded. I corrected him. I told him hospital consent forms had already been completed before surgery. He laughed. What did he say? Her answer came without hesitation. It's just paperwork the lawyer asked us to finish while he's resting. Harold looked at me. Neither of us interrupted. Linda continued. I asked whether the documents were related to medical treatment. He said no. So I told him those forms shouldn't be signed while you were recovering. My pulse quickened. What happened then? You reached for the papers anyway. She demonstrated slowly with one hand. You were trying to bring them closer. You kept squinting. Then she repeated words I had no memory of saying. Everything's blurry. Where are my glasses? The words sounded painfully familiar, even though I couldn't remember speaking them. I asked your son one more time to give them to you. He said. Again she chose every syllable carefully. He doesn't need them. Silence. The kind that presses against your ears. I wasn't comfortable with that. So I stepped out to help another patient. When I returned, she stopped. Not dramatically. Simply gathering herself. Are you assigning? How many papers? More than hospital discharge required. She looked at Harold. I remember that because the stack was unusually thick. Harold slid one of the estate documents across the desk. Would a stack approximately this size be accurate? Linda studied it. Then nodded. Very close. He placed another document beside it. Did you ever touch these papers? No. Did you read them? No. So how do you know they weren't medical forms? She answered immediately. Medical forms have hospital headers. These didn't. That single sentence changed everything. Harold didn't smile. Lawyers rarely celebrate before judges do. But I saw the smallest movement in his shoulders. Like someone finally setting down a weight. He asked another question. Did you document any of this? Linda hesitated. I documented what involved patient care. She opened her notebook. I also wrote something for myself after my shift. My eyebrows lifted. For yourself? She nodded. I've kept a journal since nursing school. I don't record names often. But sometimes something feels. She searched for the word. All unfinished. She opened to a page marked with a faded blue tab. I removed identifying medical information before bringing this. Then she began reading. Elderly patient repeatedly requested glasses before signing private documents. Family member declined despite glasses being immediately available. Patient visibly unable to focus on pages. Consider reporting if complaint arises. She closed the notebook. I never filed a formal report. I looked at her. Why not? Her expression changed. Not defensive. Regretful. Because at the time. She sighed softly. I convinced myself it wasn't my place. I'd warned him. I'd offered the glasses. I had another patient whose blood pressure was crashing. She shook her head. In nursing, you're constantly choosing which fire to put out first. I chose the one that looked life-threatening. Nobody blamed her. Least of all me. She had done more than anyone else. She had remembered. Harold thanked her and asked a few final questions about dates and timing. When she left, neither of us spoke until the office door clicked shut. Finally, Harold leaned back. This changes the case. I still don't want a case. I know. He nodded slowly. But now we have evidence. Evidence. I'd spent 40 years building a business where evidence mattered. Measurements. Invoices. Quality reports. Now my own family had become something requiring documentation. The thought exhausted me. A month later, Harold formally challenged every document signed during the recovery period. Daniel received notice through his attorney. He called me that same evening. His voice wasn't angry. It was wounded. Dad, what is this? I think you know. No, I really don't. You're trying to invalidate everything. I didn't understand what I signed. You signed willingly. I signed blindly. They're different. His breathing became louder. You think I'd trick you? I closed my eyes. I don't know what to think anymore. You've always trusted me. I did. The past tense hung between us. Sharp as broken glass. You hired a lawyer against your own son. No, I hired the same lawyer I've trusted for 19 years. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked quietly, "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I almost said yes. Then realized I didn't. Because humiliation had never been my concern. Loss had. The loss of confidence. The loss of certainty. The loss of believing my son saw me as a father before he saw me as paperwork. I didn't start this, Daniel. His reply came so softly I almost missed it. I was trying to protect everything. Everything. Our future. Our family. Our security. There it was. Not greed. Fear. The same fear he'd carried since childhood. Only now it wore an expensive suit and spoke in legal language. You thought I was going to lose everything. No, I thought. He stopped, then admitted something that sounded strangely honest. I thought you'd change your mind. About what? The inheritance. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Daniel, I was never planning to leave you with nothing. I know. But what if? His voice cracked. What if you changed it after meeting someone? Or donated most of it? Or he couldn't finish. Because the sentence itself revealed the problem. He hadn't trusted my judgment. He'd trusted his anxiety. And anxiety, once placed in the driver's seat, rarely stops at reasonable destinations. I answered as calmly as I could. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself. He whispered. I know. It was the first completely honest sentence I'd heard from him in months. And somehow, it hurt more than all the arguments combined. For the next several weeks, neither of us called. Not because there was nothing left to say. Because too much had already been said. Silence has a way of revealing whether a relationship was built on conversation or convenience. I spent my mornings walking the fence lines around the ranch. The surgeon had finally cleared me for normal activity, and every extra step felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. The east pasture needed new posts. One of the water troughs had developed a slow leak. 3 young oak saplings Margaret and I had planted years before were finally tall enough to cast real shade. Life had continued while my family was arguing over paperwork. That realization grounded me more than anything else. One Tuesday afternoon, Emily pulled into the driveway in the old blue pickup we'd restored together. She climbed out carrying a small toolbox. I figured the fence wasn't going to fix itself. I smiled. You figured right. For nearly 3 hours we worked without talking much. She held boards while I measured. I hammered while she gathered nails. The rhythm reminded me of the years when Daniel had been her age. Children often speak most honestly when their hands are busy. Finally, she broke the silence. Dad moved into the guest room. I stopped hammering. For how long? Almost 3 weeks. And your mom? Emily sighed. There's talking. That single word carried more weight than a paragraph. Talking. Not yelling. Not threatening divorce. Talking. What happened? She leaned against the fence. I think Mom found out more than she knew before. I waited. He told her he was only helping with bills. She looked down at her boots. But after the lawyer contacted everyone, she swallowed. She found copies of all the papers. What did she say? Emily gave a sad little smile. The first thing. She asked why someone helping their father would need to hide documents from their wife. I looked out across the pasture. Rebecca had always struck me as someone who wanted certainty. She might accept difficult truths. But deception, that was different. Emily continued. I've never seen her so disappointed. Not angry. Oh, she was angry. But she searched for the right word. Mostly disappointed. That word lingered with me all afternoon. Disappointment means someone expected better. Anger often means they didn't. A few days later, Harold called. We've received their response. And they're willing to mediate. No court. Not if everyone can reach an agreement. I let out a slow breath. Courtrooms decide legal questions. Families rarely leave them with emotional answers. When? Next Friday. The mediation took place in a plain conference room that looked more suited for discussing insurance policies than decades of family history. There was no judge. No witness stand. Just one neutral mediator seated between 2 long tables. Daniel arrived first. He looked older than he had 3 months earlier. Not physically. Emotionally. Rebecca came in beside him carrying a legal pad she never opened. She nodded politely when she saw me. Nothing more. Harold spread our documents across the table with quiet precision. The mediator began. We're here to determine whether these transfers reflected Mr. Dawson's informed intent. Simple words. Complicated lives. Daniel's attorney spoke first. His argument was straightforward. Every signature matched. No one disputed that. No doctor had declared me legally incompetent. No formal complaint had been filed the day of surgery. Then Harold stood. He didn't raise his voice. He simply built the timeline. Medication records. Recovery room notes. Repeated requests for eyeglasses. The nurse's testimony. My lifelong habit of reviewing every legal document personally. Finally, he placed one page in front of everyone. A photocopy of my signature from selling the company 2 years earlier. Steady, perfectly centered. Then beside it, the signature from the day of surgery. Crooked, trailing downward. Barely legible. He didn't need dramatic language. The documents spoke well enough. The mediator looked toward Daniel. Would you like to respond? For several seconds, Daniel didn't. Then he surprised everyone. I'd like to speak directly to my father. The mediator nodded. Daniel turned toward me. I never thought of it as stealing. His voice was almost painfully calm. I know that's what it looks like. But in my head, he rubbed his forehead. I kept telling myself I was organizing things before something happened. Harold remained silent. The mediator remained silent. So did I. I told myself it would all be mine eventually anyway. His eyes filled with tears he clearly hadn't planned on showing. And then, he laughed once. Once I'd convinced myself of that, it stopped feeling wrong. No one interrupted. Because sometimes the most important moments happen after someone hears their own words out loud. Rebecca looked at him. Not with hatred. With disbelief. You never told me that. He couldn't meet her eyes. I know. You said your father wanted everything simplified. You said he'd already decided. His shoulders slumped. I know. She closed her notebook. Still unopened. I defended you. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. To everyone. That hurt him more than anything Harold could have argued. The mediator finally spoke. Mr. Dawson. Looking at me. What outcome are you seeking? I had thought about that question for weeks. Every morning. Every night. I knew exactly what I wanted. I want every document signed after my surgery declared invalid. Harold nodded. The mediator wrote something down. And after that, I looked across the table at my son. I want my family back. Nobody moved. I don't know if that's possible. I smiled sadly. Neither do I. But I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in truth. Daniel covered his face with both hands. For the first time since all this began. He looked like the 11-year-old boy sitting on the couch with a blue science fair ribbon. Not because he'd been caught. Because he'd finally disappointed someone he loved. The mediation lasted another 2 hours. Lawyers adjusted language. Financial authorities were revoked. Every transfer completed during my recovery period would be rescinded. Fresh estate documents would be drafted only after independent medical confirmation that I fully understood every page. By the time everyone signed the agreement, the room felt emotionally exhausted. As we prepared to leave, Rebecca walked over. I owe you an apology. You don't. I do. She looked me straight in the eye. I wanted security so badly. I stopped asking enough questions. I nodded. Fear makes investigators out of some people. And accomplices out of others. She lowered her head. I think that's true. Daniel approached last. Neither of us knew how to begin. Finally he spoke. I don't expect forgiveness. I know. I just... His voice cracked again. I wish I could go back. I believed him. That's the difficult thing about regret. By the time it becomes genuine, the opportunity that required it has already passed. I can't give you yesterday, I said quietly. But tomorrow. I paused. It depends on what you do with today. He nodded once. No promises. No dramatic embrace. Just a quiet understanding that rebuilding trust would take far longer than destroying it ever had. As I walked toward my truck, Harold caught up beside me. Do you know what? I've represented families for almost 4 decades. And most cases end with someone winning. He looked back toward the building. I think this one ended with everyone finally seeing what was actually happening. I thought about that all the way home. Recognition, not revenge. That had always been the real turning point. Because people rarely change after losing an argument. Sometimes, they change after losing the story they've been telling themselves. Winter gave way to spring one careful day at a time. The first robins returned before sunrise. The creek behind the north pasture rose with the melting snow. The oak tree's Margaret, and I had planted over 4 decades began filling with new leaves, each one looking almost impossibly bright against branches that had seemed lifeless only weeks earlier. Recovery, I realized, never arrives all at once. Whether it's a body, a business, or a family, it comes quietly enough that one morning you notice you're no longer counting the pain. 3 months after the mediation, Harold invited me to his office again. This time there wasn't a stack of disputed documents waiting on the conference table. There was a single blue folder. Everything's recorded. He slid it toward me. The court approved the stipulated order. So it's finished. The legal part. He smiled faintly. The personal part is above my pay grade. Inside the folder were copies of the rescinded transfers. Every deed restored. Every investment account returned to its previous structure. Every authorization signed during my recovery officially declared void. One sentence caught my attention. Documents executed, while the grantor lacked sufficient opportunity to meaningfully review their contents. Opportunity. Not intelligence. Not age. Opportunity. The wording mattered. It acknowledged something people often forget. The problem wasn't that I had grown old. The problem was that I had been denied the chance to understand what was placed before me. There's an important difference. Growing older doesn't take away dignity. Other people do that when they mistake vulnerability for permission. As I stood to leave, Harold cleared his throat. One more thing. He handed me another envelope. This came from the hospital. Inside was a handwritten letter. Not typed. Not dictated. Written in careful blue ink. It was from Linda Foster. She explained that she had retired the previous week after 33 years of nursing. Near the end she wrote, "I spent years believing nurses only changed lives through medicine. Thank you for reminding me that sometimes the most important thing we preserve is someone's voice when they aren't strong enough to use it themselves." I read those lines 3 times, then folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. Some people save lives once. Others save them in ways no monitor ever records. A week later I drove to the hospital carrying a small wooden box. I'd built it from black walnut harvested on the ranch nearly 20 years earlier. The lid was inlaid with a simple brass plate. It read, "For Linda Foster, who remembered." The receptionist told me she had already retired. I left the box anyway. Not because I expected anything in return. Gratitude should never depend on witnessing someone's reaction. It simply deserves to be expressed. By early summer, something unexpected happened. Daniel called. Not to discuss lawyers. Not to discuss money. He wanted advice. I found an old milling machine. I almost laughed. "You've never called me about machinery." "I know. I don't actually want the machine." "What do you want?" "I want..." He hesitated. "To know how you decide whether something is worth restoring." The question wasn't about steel. We both knew that. I answered the only way I could. You stop asking what it used to be worth. You ask what it could become if someone invested the time. There was a long silence. Finally he said, "I think I understand." "I'm not sure you do." He laughed softly. "No, probably not. But I'd like to learn." So we started small. Not family dinners. Not holidays. Not emotional conversations. Saturday mornings. 2 hours in my workshop. Nothing else. The first month we barely discussed anything except tools. How to sharpen a plain blade. Why old-growth oak behaves differently than newer lumber. How measuring twice isn't really about measurements. It's about respecting the cost of mistakes. One morning he stopped sanding a cabinet door. "Dad, I've been seeing a counselor." I kept working. "Good. I kept thinking fear was making me responsible. He brushed sawdust off the bench. But mostly, it was making me controlling. I nodded. Fear likes disguises. He looked over. Did you know? I suspected. What gave it away? You always tried to control tomorrow. When today was difficult. He stared at the floor. I learned that from you. I looked at him. No, you learned hard work from me. You learned fear somewhere else. The distinction seemed to matter to him. By autumn, Rebecca began visiting again. The first few times, she stayed only long enough to drop off homemade soup or fresh bread. Eventually, she stayed for coffee. Then lunch. One afternoon, she admitted something I'd never expected to hear. I kept every spreadsheet, every financial projection, every inheritance estimate. She smiled sadly. I deleted all of them. Why? Because I finally realized. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. You can't build security by planning someone else's death. There wasn't anything to add. The sentence completed itself. Emily, meanwhile, received an acceptance letter from the State University's engineering program. She came running into the workshop, waving the envelope over her head. I got in. I hugged her before she'd finished speaking. I knew you would. You didn't know. I did. You've been taking apart engines since middle school. She laughed. Apparently admissions officers like that. When she started talking about student loans, I interrupted. No. She frowned. What? No loans. She blinked. I don't understand. I walked into my office and returned with another folder. Inside was paperwork Harold and I had prepared months earlier. A scholarship trust. Funded in Margaret's name. Not just for Emily. For any student from our county entering engineering, nursing, skilled trades or agricultural science. Emily would be the first recipient. But not the last. Tears filled her eyes. You never told anyone. It wasn't time. She threw her arms around me. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just study hard. She laughed through her tears. I can do that. News of the scholarship spread faster than I'd expected. The local newspaper asked for an interview. I almost declined. Then I thought about Linda. About Harold. About everyone whose quiet integrity had mattered more than public recognition. So I agreed. The reporter asked why I'd created the program. I didn't mention the lawsuit. I didn't mention the papers. I didn't mention betrayal. Instead, I answered honestly. Because communities survive when experience becomes opportunity for the next generation. That was the real reason. Pain may have accelerated the decision. But purpose had been there long before. Several months later, I attended the scholarship banquet. Nothing fancy. About 80 folding chairs in the high school gymnasium. A podium decorated by students. Coffee that tasted exactly like every community fundraiser I'd ever attended. As I walked inside, the superintendent greeted me. Mr. Dawson. He shook my hand firmly. We're honored. I smiled. I'm just happy to be here. Then something happened I hadn't expected. People began introducing themselves. Former employees. Children of machinists I'd hired 30 years earlier. A teacher whose classroom we'd quietly funded. A firefighter whose department had received anonymous equipment donations. One after another, they thanked me for things I'd almost forgotten. Not because they remembered my money. Because they remembered being seen. Recognition has a strange way of traveling through time. It often arrives decades after the work that earned it. Near the end of the evening, the superintendent invited me to the podium. I hadn't prepared a speech. So I simply told the truth. When I was young, I believed success meant building something people could measure. A business, a balance sheet, a ranch. I looked across the room. I was wrong. People listened. The most valuable things you'll ever build are the things people carry away after they leave you. The confidence you give, the honesty you model, the trust you protect. Those become someone else's foundation. When I finished, there wasn't immediate applause. Just a few quiet seconds. Sometimes silence means people aren't impressed. Other times, it means they're thinking. Then the applause came. Not loud, not theatrical. Steady, sincere. As I stepped down from the stage, I noticed Daniel standing near the back beside Rebecca and Emily. He hadn't told me he was coming. He simply nodded. A small gesture. But this time, it wasn't asking for approval. It was offering respect. That mattered more than either of us said aloud. Looking back now, people sometimes ask whether this story is about inheritance. It isn't. Others think it's about greed. That isn't quite right either. It's about a system. Not a legal system. A human one. A pattern that repeats itself every day. Someone becomes vulnerable. Someone else convinces themselves that urgency justifies shortcuts. Paperwork replaces conversation. Control disguises itself as care. And little by little, a person's voice is treated like an obstacle instead of something worth protecting. That's the system. It doesn't begin with one signature. It begins the moment we decide that efficiency matters more than dignity. The reason my story ended differently wasn't because I was richer than someone else. It wasn't because I hired a good lawyer. It wasn't even because the documents were overturned. It ended differently because one nurse refused to forget a man asking for his glasses. She remembered a simple truth. Understanding must come before agreement. Without that, a signature is only ink. With it, it's a choice. And choices are what give every life its worth. Tell me in the comments, if you had been in my position, what would have hurt you more,